It was a crisp, sunny morning in the heart of suburban America. The bell at Riverside Public School chimed sharply at 8:30 a.m., signaling the start of yet another school day. Kids of all ages poured through the wide front doors, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Backpacks slung over shoulders and sneakers squeaking against polished floors, the students rushed to their classrooms. The hallways buzzed with energy, lockers slamming shut, teachers herding children to their seats. Among the crowd was Jaden Parker, a 14-year-old black boy with a spark in his eyes and dreams bigger than the small town he lived in. Jaden was no ordinary student. His teachers often marveled at his sharp mind and hunger for learning. He had a particular knack for solving complex math problems and often stayed after class to ask thoughtful questions. His dream was to one day become an engineer and build technologies that could make life easier for everyone. Despite his ambitions and friendly demeanor, Jaden didn't always feel like he fit in at Riverside. Most of the students were white, and though many were kind, there were subtle signs that reminded Jaden he was seen differently. Jaden walked into school that morning with his usual confident stride, his notebook clutched tightly in one hand. He had spent the previous evening perfecting his science project, a solar-powered car model, and was eager to show it to his classmates. His teacher, Mr. Johnson, had promised to give him 5 minutes to present it during homeroom. Jaden's passion for learning wasn't just about academics. He was also a great athlete and a key player on the school's basketball team. His teammates respected him not just for his skills on the court, but for his leadership and quick thinking during games. But beneath his confidence, Jaden often felt the weight of being one of the few black kids in school. He had learned to brush off the casual comments like, "You're so well-spoken," or the way some teachers seemed surprised when he aced a test. The biases were small but undeniable. During group projects, Jaden noticed how some kids hesitated to pair with him unless a teacher assigned them. In the cafeteria, he often sat alone, not because he wasn't friendly, but because the other kids didn't always make space for him. Even that morning, as Jaden entered the classroom, he caught a brief exchange between two students whispering and glancing at him. He couldn't hear what they said, but the tone and smirks were familiar. He had learned to ignore such things, focusing instead on the goals he had set for himself. As he settled into his seat and pulled out his project, Jaden reminded himself of his father's words. "You have to work twice as hard to get half as far, but never let anyone dim your light." What Jaden didn't know was that this ordinary day would soon spiral into an extraordinary event, one that would test his resolve and change everything for him and his father. It was second period when the situation began to unfold. The school halls were unusually quiet as most students were in their classes. Jaden was sitting at his desk in Mr. Johnson's science classroom, eagerly awaiting his turn to present his solar-powered car model. Just as Mr. Johnson was calling Jaden up to the front, the classroom door burst open and in came Ethan Miller, a privileged and entitled classmate whose family was well known in the community. Ethan was visibly upset, his face flushed red as he pointed accusingly toward Jaden. "My phone's gone!" he exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw Jaden standing near my bag this morning. He must have taken it." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Jaden, who looked up in shock. "What?" Jaden stammered. "I didn't take your phone, Ethan. I don't even know where you left it." Ethan, however, was insistent. "You were right there. I know you took it," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. Some of the students began whispering among themselves, their murmurs growing louder. "Enough," Mr. Johnson said, stepping forward. "Ethan, calm down. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Ethan wouldn't back down. "Look in his bag if you don't believe me," he shouted. Jaden was taken aback. "You can check my bag," he said firmly, holding it out. "I didn't take anything." Mr. Johnson hesitated but eventually nodded. "Jaden, I trust you, but to clear this up, let's just check, okay?" Jaden nodded, trying to keep his composure. He felt the weight of everyone's eyes on him as Mr. Johnson opened his bag and searched through it. Of course, the phone wasn't there. "There's nothing here," Mr. Johnson said, his tone firm. "Ethan, are you sure you didn't just misplace it?" But before Ethan could respond, another teacher entered the room, Ms. Carter, the vice principal. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her sharp gaze sweeping the room. "Ethan's phone is missing," Mr. Johnson explained. "He believes Jaden might have it, but we checked, and it's not in his bag." Ms. Carter frowned. "This is a serious accusation," she said, her eyes narrowing on Jaden. "We'll need to investigate further. Jaden, come with me." Jaden followed Ms. Carter to the office, his heart pounding, but his face calm. Ethan trailed behind, still muttering under his breath. By the time they reached the administrative office, the story had spread across the school, and students were already speculating about what had happened. In the office, Ms. Carter called Ethan's parents and informed them of the situation. She didn't, however, make any effort to contact Jaden's father. Instead, she decided to escalate matters without solid proof. "This isn't the first time we've had issues with stolen items," she said, her tone almost accusatory. "Given the circumstances, I think it's best we involve the authorities." "What?" Jaden said, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. "You're calling the police? You didn't even ask me anything." "You're not helping your case by arguing, Jaden," Ms. Carter said dismissively. Within minutes, a police officer arrived at the school, a middle-aged man named Officer Bradley. He walked into the office with a no-nonsense demeanor, his gaze immediately locking onto Jaden. "What's the situation?" Officer Bradley asked, glancing at Ms. Carter. She quickly explained the missing phone and Ethan's accusation, conveniently omitting any mention of the bag search or lack of evidence. Officer Bradley turned to Jaden. "Son, I need you to come with me," he said, his tone flat. "But I didn't do anything," Jaden said, his voice unwavering. "You're arresting me without any proof?" Officer Bradley sighed. "We'll sort this out at the station. For now, let's go." Ms. Carter didn't intervene, nor did she challenge the officer's decision. Instead, she stood silently as Jaden was handcuffed in front of Ethan, who smirked triumphantly. As Jaden was led out of the school, students gathered in the hallways, their whispers echoing around him. Some looked shocked, others curious, and a few, like Ethan's friends, seemed to find the situation amusing. Jaden kept his head high, refusing to let the humiliation show. He remembered his father's advice. "Dignity is your armor. Don't let them see you break." On the way to the station, Officer Bradley didn't say much. Jaden, however, spoke up. "You're arresting me based on one person's word," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you even have any proof?" "You were the last person seen near the bag," Officer Bradley said curtly. "That's enough for now." "No, it's not," Jaden said. "It's not enough for an arrest. You know that." Officer Bradley glanced at him in the rearview mirror but didn't respond. "I'm not here to make it easy for you to accuse an innocent person," Jaden shot back. Jaden's composure and confidence left Officer Bradley momentarily speechless. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting from a 14-year-old. Meanwhile, word of Jaden's arrest began to spread outside the station. His father, who was at work, received a call from one of Jaden's friends. Without hesitation, he left his office and headed straight to the station, determined to get to the bottom of what had happened. The stage was now set for an extraordinary confrontation, one that would expose the biases that had led to Jaden's arrest and reveal the shocking truth about his father. The air in the police station was heavy with tension. Officers went about their tasks, paperwork rustling and phones ringing intermittently. In the middle of this controlled chaos, the station doors swung open and a tall, composed man walked in. David Parker, Jaden's father, had an air of quiet authority that immediately drew attention. David wasn't flashy. He wore a neatly pressed button-down shirt and slacks, his tie slightly loosened from the hurried drive. His face was calm, but his sharp eyes scanned the room with precision, taking in every detail. The officers barely gave him a second glance at first. assuming he was just another concerned parent. But there was something about his presence, an unspoken confidence, that made people take notice. "Excuse me," David said in a firm but polite tone as he approached the desk sergeant. "I'm here for my son, Jaden Parker. I understand he's been brought in." The sergeant looked up, mildly surprised at the composed demeanor. "And you are?" "I'm his father," David said, his voice steady. "I'd like to see him immediately." The sergeant hesitated, glancing toward Officer Bradley, who was standing nearby. Bradley walked over, holding a notepad. "Mr. Parker, your son is being questioned regarding a missing phone at his school. We're conducting our investigation." David's lips tightened, but he maintained his calm. "Questioning?" he asked. "Is he under arrest?" Bradley hesitated. "Technically, no, but—" "Then why is he here?" David interrupted, his voice cool but firm. "And why wasn't I informed before he was taken out of school? You're aware that minors cannot be questioned without a parent or legal guardian present, aren't you?" Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "This is standard procedure." "No, officer," David said, leaning in slightly. "It's not, and you know it." The room fell silent. The officers around them exchanged glances, sensing the shift in power dynamics. David's tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried a weight of authority that was impossible to ignore. "I'd like to see my son now," David continued, "and I'd like to know what evidence you have that justified bringing him here." Bradley, caught off guard, muttered, "We're still gathering evidence." "So none," David said sharply. "You arrested a 14-year-old boy based on a baseless accusation, without probable cause, and without notifying his parent. Do you realize the legal implications of your actions?" David was led to the interrogation room where Jaden sat, his head held high despite the situation. When he saw his father, a wave of relief washed over him, though he quickly masked it with a small nod. "You okay, son?" David asked, his voice softening for the first time. "I'm fine, Dad," Jaden replied, his composure matching his father's. David turned back to Officer Bradley, who had followed them into the room. "I need a detailed explanation of what happened and why my son is here. Now." Bradley began recounting the events, stumbling over his words as David's piercing gaze never wavered. "So let me get this straight," David said once Bradley finished. "A student accused my son of theft, and without evidence or investigation, you deemed it appropriate to bring him here in handcuffs? It's protocol to act quickly in such situations." Bradley started, but David cut him off. "No, officer. Protocol requires due diligence and the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. This isn't an investigation. This is a blatant example of racial profiling." Bradley's face flushed. "That's not what this is about." "Then what is it about?" David countered. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my son was targeted simply because he fits a stereotype you've decided to believe." By now, a small crowd of officers had gathered outside the room, watching the interaction. David turned to face them, his voice rising just enough to be heard through the glass. "You all seem surprised," he said, addressing the room. "Let me introduce myself properly. I'm David Parker, a civil rights attorney with over 20 years of experience. I've spent my career holding institutions accountable for exactly this kind of behavior." The room went silent. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, and even Bradley took a step back. David continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I've seen cases like this too many times. A young black boy is accused of something he didn't do, and instead of investigating, you jump to conclusions. You bypass procedures and strip him of his dignity, assuming no one will challenge you. Well, today, you're wrong." The weight of his words hung in the air. Bradley tried to recover. "Mr. Parker, we're just trying to do our job." "No," David shot back. "Your job is to protect and serve. Your job is to uphold justice, not to perpetuate bias." and if you don't know the difference, you have no business wearing that badge. David pulled out his phone and began documenting everything. I'm going to need a copy of the incident report, he said. Every name involved in this case, officers, school staff, and the student who made the accusation. And trust me, if this isn't resolved immediately, I will take this to court. I'm sure the media would love to hear about how a 14-year-old boy was wrongfully detained because of baseless accusations. Bradley hesitated, then nodded. We'll release your son. This was all just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? David said, his tone icy. You call handcuffing a child without evidence a misunderstanding? No, officer, this is negligence, and it won't go unnoticed. David turned to Jaden, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Let's go, son. As they walked out of the station, every eye was on them. David's calm yet commanding presence had shifted the atmosphere completely. Jaden looked up at his father, a mix of pride and gratitude in his eyes. You handled that like a pro, Dad, Jaden said as they reached the car. David smiled. It's not just about handling it, son. It's about making sure they think twice before doing this to anyone else. Back at home, David began drafting a formal complaint against the police department and the school. He reached out to local media outlets, determined to make this a public issue. I told you, Jaden, he said as they sat at the dining table. You have to work twice as hard, but you also have to know when to stand up for why. Yourself. They'll try to silence you, but knowledge and confidence are your greatest weapons. This wasn't just a victory for Jaden. It was a lesson in resilience and the power of standing up against injustice. David Parker wasted no time. As soon as he and Jaden were home, he set his plan into motion. First, he sent a detailed email to the school board, demanding an emergency meeting to address the actions of the school staff and administration. Alongside this, he drafted a formal complaint against the police department for racial profiling and the unlawful detention of his son. The next morning, David walked into the school for the meeting with the same composed confidence he had displayed at the police station. Parents, teachers, and school board members were already present, murmuring among themselves about the recent events. The tension in the room was palpable. The principal, Mr. Hayes, tried to maintain control. Mr. Parker, we regret the incident, but I assure you the school acted in what it believed to be the best interests of all students. David smiled politely, but didn't let the principal's words slide. Best interests? He said. Your staff accused my son of theft without evidence, called the police without notifying me, and allowed him to be humiliated in front of his peers. Please, tell me how that served anyone's interests, except perhaps your biases. David then pulled out a folder containing documents, including the school's code of conduct and federal guidelines on the rights of minors. He flipped through the pages methodically, the room growing quieter with each passing second. Let's start with the basics, he said, addressing the room. Section 7 of your Code of Conduct states that no disciplinary action, including police involvement, can be taken without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Where was the evidence against my son? No one answered. David pressed on. Then there's the matter of racial bias, he continued. Do you know how often black students are disproportionately targeted for disciplinary actions in schools like this? Studies show they're 3 times more likely to face punishment than their white peers for the same infractions. What happened to my son is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger systemic problem. Mr. Hayes and the other staff members looked visibly uncomfortable. A few parents shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. David then turned his attention to Officer Bradley, who had been invited to the meeting at David's insistence. Officer Bradley, he said, his tone sharp but controlled, I'd like to know on what grounds you arrested my son. You claimed he was the last person seen near the bag. Is that your definition of probable cause? Bradley stammered. We acted based on the information we had at the time. Information? David shot back. Or assumptions? because it seems to me that your actions were based on a stereotype rather than facts. Did you search anyone else? Question any other students?" Bradley looked down, unable to meet David's gaze. "I didn't think so," David said. "You violated my son's rights, and you did so without a second thought. As an officer of the law, you should know better. But instead, you chose the easy path, the path of prejudice." The silence in the room was deafening. David's words hung in the air, heavy with undeniable truth. One of the teachers, Ms. Taylor, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Mr. Parker, I want to apologize. I realize now that we should have handled things differently. I'm deeply sorry for what Jaden went through." Her admission seemed to open the floodgates. Other staff members nodded in agreement, murmuring apologies. Even Mr. Hayes, though reluctant, admitted, "This situation has made it clear that we need to reevaluate our protocols and biases." David didn't let them off the hook so easily. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they're not enough. I want to see real changes, training for your staff, revised policies, and a commitment to ensuring no other child has to go through what my son did." The school board unanimously agreed to David's demands, promising immediate action. With the school board's acknowledgement of their mistakes, David turned to Jaden, who had been quietly observing the proceedings. "Jaden," he said, his voice softening, "is there anything you'd like to say?" Jaden stood up, his shoulders back and his chin high. "I just want people to see me for who I am," he said, his voice steady. "Not for the color of my skin, but for my hard work, my dreams, and my character. That's all I've ever wanted." His words moved everyone in the room. Even those who had been defensive at the start of the meeting seemed genuinely touched. The day didn't end there. David took Jaden with him to the police station where they met with the police chief. David presented his case against Officer Bradley, laying out the officer's misconduct and the racial profiling that had occurred. The chief, aware of David's reputation as a civil rights attorney, was quick to act. He apologized directly to Jaden and promised to launch an internal investigation into the incident. "We can't undo what happened," the chief admitted, "but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." David nodded. "That's all we ask, for accountability and change." As they left the station, Jaden looked up at his father. "You didn't just stand up for me," he said. "You stood up for everyone who's ever been treated unfairly." David smiled, resting a hand on Jaden's shoulder. "That's what we do, son. We don't let the world define us. We define ourselves." Jaden's innocence had been proven, but the victory was more than just personal. It was a statement against the systemic biases that had tried to bring him down. As father and son walked into the evening light, there was a renewed sense of hope and strength between them. The morning after the pivotal school board meeting, Riverside Public School issued a formal apology. In a carefully worded statement, they acknowledged their mishandling of the incident, the baseless accusations against Jaden, and the racial biases that had influenced their actions. "We deeply regret the distress caused to Jaden Parker and his family," the statement read. "This incident has highlighted flaws in our processes, and we are committed to implementing anti-bias training and revising our protocols to ensure fairness and respect for all students." The local police department followed suit. The police chief, visibly uneasy during a press conference, admitted, "The actions taken in this case fell short of our standards. We are conducting an internal review and have suspended Officer Bradley pending further investigation. We apologize to Jaden Parker and his family for the injustice they faced." While the apologies were a step in the right direction, David Parker knew they weren't enough. David decided to take the matter to a broader platform. He appeared on local and national news outlets, his calm yet determined voice resonating with viewers across the country. Jaden sat beside him during interviews, sharing his perspective as a teenager who had faced unjust treatment simply because of his race. "This isn't just about my son," David said during an interview. "It's about every child who has been judged or mistreated because of the color of their skin. Racism thrives in silence. By speaking out, we can hold systems accountable and demand the changes our society so desperately needs. The story gained widespread attention. Social media erupted with discussions about the incident, and hashtags like #Justice for Jaden and #Stand Against Racism began trending. Civil rights organizations reached out to David, offering their support. The incident became a rallying cry for broader reform in schools and law enforcement. In a speech at a community event organized to address systemic racism, David stood before a crowd of parents, educators, and students. His words were powerful, yet deeply personal. "Racism doesn't always show itself in grand, obvious ways," he began. "Sometimes it's subtle, a suspicious glance, an assumption, a decision made without thought. But these small moments build a culture of inequality, and that culture destroys lives, one injustice at a time." He paused, scanning the audience. "It's not enough to say we're not racist. We must actively work to be anti-racist. We must challenge our biases, educate ourselves, and teach our children to do better. Because if we don't, we'll keep failing kids like Jaden, and that's a failure we can't afford." The crowd erupted in applause. Parents lined up after the event to thank David for his courage and to pledge their support for change. Back at home, Jaden and David sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their quiet neighborhood. The media storm had finally begun to calm, and life was starting to return to normal. Jaden broke the silence. "You know, Dad, this whole thing was scary, but it also showed me something important." "What's that?" David asked, turning to him. "That I can make a difference," Jaden said with a small smile. "Even when things feel unfair or impossible, I can stand up for myself and for others, and maybe one day I can inspire other kids to do the same." David's eyes glistened with pride. "You already are, son," he said. "You've shown strength and grace through all of this, and whatever you choose to do in life, I'll always have your back." Jaden nodded, his confidence restored. "I think I still want to be an engineer," he said. "But now I also want to do something more. Maybe build things that help people or make the world fairer somehow." David chuckled. "With your brains and heart, I have no doubt you'll do just that." The story ends on a hopeful and inspiring note. Jaden returns to school, where he's greeted with support from classmates who have learned from the incident. The school's new anti-bias initiatives are implemented, and teachers undergo training to ensure a more inclusive environment. David continues his work as a civil rights attorney, using Jaden's case as an example in his advocacy efforts. Together, father and son become symbols of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up against injustice. The final words of the story echo David's mantra: "Change starts with awareness, grows with action, and thrives with hope." And together, we can build a world where every child is seen for who they truly are, not the color of their skin.